Bully begins with three school delinquents, led by a student named Miles. The three solely came to school to intimidate other children who they deemed weak. One of the students that is constantly bullied is Jimmy Mulligan, a big young man. Despite being constantly bullied by Miles, Jimmy never fought him. Jimmy has two pals at school, Andy and Bobby, who are always supportive of him. Not only that, but he has really kind and loving parents. One day, Jimmy and his friends run into Miles and the group on their way to school. Miles and his friends asked Jimmy for $100. That type of money was definitely too much for him, who hailed from a modest household. Even though he told them he didn't have much money, Miles didn't care and compelled Jimmy to give him $100. Miles not only abused Jimmy but also Bobby, who behaved femininely. Jimmy attempts to console and calm Bobby after Miles humiliates him in front of the class. Jimmy then invited his pals to eat at the cafeteria, promising them a treat. In the cafeteria, Andy and Bobby were taken aback by Jimmy's ability to consume copious amounts of food. Nonetheless, they never made fun of him for his voracious eating. After that, Andy and Bobby try to pair Jimmy with Adrian, a girl at their school who they frequently catch sneaking eyes at Jimmy when they are dining in the cafeteria. Shortly after, Miles appeared and sat next to Jimmy, charging him the $100 he requested. One of the kids was bothered by Miles' presence and begged him not to make a mess and leave the cafeteria. Miles yelled and berated the student he thought was weak after receiving a punishment. However, another kid who is physically larger and stronger than Miles wants to teach him a lesson for causing a scene in the cafeteria when everyone is eating lunch. Miles' stomach shrank in an instant, and he walked out of the cafeteria. Miles confronted Jimmy again after school, forcing him to pay up a $100 bill. Jimmy, on the other hand, argued that he didn't have much money and didn't owe Miles anything, so he wasn't obligated to hand over the cash. After hearing Jimmy's statements, which implied resistance, Miles did not hesitate to beat him on the side of the road. Miles had barely quit pounding Jimmy when an elderly man approached and threatened to file a complaint with the police. Miles accelerated and drove away. The elderly man then assisted Jimmy and took him to his home to treat his injuries. The man introduced himself as Mr. Actions. While at Mr. Actions' house, Jimmy discovered that he was a former world heavyweight fighter. Jimmy then begged Mr. Actions to teach him as a boxer so he could fight Miles and stop the bullying. The old man wanted to help Jimmy defeat Miles, but he was too old to train him. Mr. Actions says he'll ask his friends to help him train. After that, Mr. Actions brings Jimmy home and informs his parents about the beating. Jimmy's parents are extremely grateful to Mr. Actions for treating him and being willing to take him home. They promptly gave Jimmy permission to practice boxing as per Mr. Actions' plan. They even joined Jimmy to Manny's boxing training arena. Mr. Actions then informs Manny of Jimmy's issues. Manny offers to assist Jimmy as long as he is committed and does not give up because boxing training is difficult. After accepting it, Jimmy began practicing boxing with Manny on a regular basis, with Mr. Actions attentively monitoring his development at each training session. Jimmy then explained how Miles frequently pushed him to give him $100. Mr. Actions then proposed that Jimmy raise Miles' request to $200, with the proviso that he give him 1 month. Mr. Actions suggests that Jimmy prepare himself and succeed in overthrowing Miles at the given moment, so avoiding having to pay Miles the $200. When Miles arrived the following day to collect the money, Jimmy followed Mr. Actions' suggestion. Miles appeared to pause for a moment, as the time period was extremely long. However, he eventually decided to give Jimmy a month's deadline if Jimmy quadrupled the amount of money. Jimmy could breathe a sigh of relief after Miles stopped bugging him about money. However, when Jimmy trains boxing with Manny in the afternoon, he appears sluggish and unmotivated. Jimmy argued that he was exhausted, but he couldn't fool Manny's professional assessments, which confirmed that Jimmy was emotionally fatigued rather than physically exhausted. Manny immediately informed Mr. Actions about Jimmy's situation, pointing out that he had stopped taking training seriously. While on his way home, Mr. Actions inquired as to why Jimmy was not feeling like practicing that day. Jimmy then stated that he was exhausted and that all of his training was not yielding results. He remained weak and unable to defend himself when Miles tormented him. When Mr. Actions hears Jimmy's disappointment, he tries to cheer him up by telling him that no effort is wasted and that whatever the outcome, he would learn a valuable lesson from his efforts. When he returned home, his father observed that he was losing interest for training. His father did not force him to finish his training and left all decisions up to him. However, his father stated that one day he hoped Jimmy could teach his children how to defend themselves so that their children would not have to face the same tragedy as him. Jimmy's fighting spirit was revived after thinking about his father's remarks, and he was resolved to continue practicing seriously. The next day, Miles and his group continued to frighten Jimmy and his buddies. They did not hesitate to beat Bobby in front of a large crowd. Jimmy then approached Bobby, who was crying alone, and attempted to comfort him. But Bobby admits that he is desperate since they can't do anything against Miles and his cronies. Jimmy disagrees, telling Bobby that he knows how to beat Miles and halt their tormenting. When Jimmy arrived home, he rushed to Manny's boxing club on his bicycle, despite the fact that he had always been picked up by Mr. Actions due to the distance. Mr. Actions is overjoyed because Jimmy is excited to begin boxing training again. Jimmy was so excited that he accidentally hit Manny and tumbled to the ground. Manny was relieved, not irritated, that Jimmy was resuming his boxing career. Long story short, Jimmy trains boxing every day with tenacity and desire. Manny boosted Jimmy's training regimen with more physical activity and mixed martial arts. Mr. Actions, on the other hand, shapes Jimmy's mindset by offering advice and proposals to motivate him to fight. Meanwhile, at school, Jimmy tells Andy about his boxing training and how he beat Miles. At the same time, Adrian approaches Jimmy and the two decide to date. Adrian and Jimmy attend a party at their friend's place. After a heart-to-heart conversation, they learned they were quite compatible and connected when they discussed a variety of topics. They chose to date. While on a date, Eddie, one of Miles' men, irritated Jimmy and Adrian by shouting insults. Jimmy, now more confident, attempts to attack Eddie and toss him out. Time passed, and it was time for Jimmy to fulfill his pledge to Miles. Jimmy was determined not to let Miles blackmail or bully him again. That morning, he awoke full of confidence and determination. When Miles arrived at school, he immediately confronted him and threatened to harm his buddies if he broke his vow and attempted to flee. While in the restroom, Jimmy encounters a young man named Vinny, who learns about his and Miles' feud. Vinny, who was aware that Jimmy had been practicing boxing at Manny's boxing facility, encouraged and wished him success. Eddie, who was in the toilet cubicle, overheard Jimmy and Vinny's chat and reported it to Miles without their knowledge. Eddie then summons Glassjaw Billy, a recidivist, to school to be Jimmy's opponent, per Miles' instructions. The dispute between Jimmy and Miles appears to have expanded throughout the school, attracting everyone's attention to see who will triumph. Jimmy confidently approached Miles and his companions. Miles, who already knows Jimmy will not give him the money, intends to beat him down with the help of Glassjaw. However, Vinny acts faster by sending his men to grab Glassjaw, forcing Miles to battle Jimmy on his own. The fight started. Jimmy initially found it difficult to deal with Miles. However, he refused to give up and fought Miles. Jimmy was able to deflect Miles' attack and deliver a savage barrage in his face. Jimmy was no longer a meek, chubby youngster who let others bully him. He can now defend himself and is determined to get stronger in order to protect the weak from persecution. When Miles' friends saw he was being encircled, they attempted to band together against Jimmy. However, Andy and Bobby did not stay mute. They both helped Jimmy fight his bullies until they finally defeat Miles and his friends. After winning the feud, Jimmy advises Miles not to bully anyone at school. But Miles does not appear to care. Mr. Actions, on the other hand, who saw Jimmy's feud with Miles from behind the crowd, appeared to be quite proud of his protege because, while Jimmy had become stronger, he still had a decent heart. The quarrel between Jimmy and Miles appears to have gone viral when the incident was captured and published on social media networks. It was so exciting that the recording was even broadcast on a local television channel, making Jimmy's efforts against his bullies a topic of discussion in the town. They'd all admired Jimmy's courage in standing up to the bullies. His parents are also delighted that their son can now stand up for himself and is no longer bullied. The video concludes with Jimmy, Andy, Bobby, and Adrian, who have gained confidence and become the focus of attention at school after successfully toppling a bunch of bullies who were causing problems for the youngsters. It's simple to push someone until they push you back. Don't bully individuals for whatever reason, and don't consider yourself to be a flawless person because everyone has strengths and shortcomings. The movie concludes.